snatch it back and hold it, baby, one more time.
This is the final part in the series, and I wanted to explore customizing the sound of the Mark IV for the particular song that I'm practicing. When I watch some of the great guitar players on YouTube do similar things, they seem to know in advance exactly which effect will get them the desired result and where to position all those knobs. Sometimes they make adjustments and I can't really hear the difference in the final video. I'm not an audio engineer and I'm not going to be showing you how to get the perfect sound. What I do have is a beginner's mindset, and I want to share some approaches I took that helped me get to the sound I was after. Originally it took weeks, but instead of making weeks-long video, I'm going to try to recreate the steps I took in about 10 minutes. Let's get started. The first tip I want to emphasize here is that I would highly recommend every one of you record yourself. Until I made this series of videos, I would strum, put down my pick, adjust settings with the mouse, pick up my pick, strum, rinse, repeat. We have this easily accessible built-in recorder, we might as well use it. Record a couple of measures and loop it, then tinker with the settings. It has helped me to hear all the flaws in my playing and find new areas to focus on in my practice. So at the risk of repeating myself one last time, record yourself. To avoid copyright issues, I'm not going to play the original main riff from the song, but use a riff that I made up that was, let's say, inspired by that song. I originally recorded this with the final amp sound on, but here it is in the DI format. I always start my signal chain with a noise gate. When I set my guitar down for the day, I want to stay in a happy marriage, so keeping my speakers from emitting a constant buzz is one small step in that direction. And frankly, I think switching from drums to guitars was a much bigger step, but that's not so relevant to this video. I start by strumming, muting, and then making sure it turns on when the strings are muted. I usually come back to it when I'm done with the rest of the signal chain. Taking what I learned from the last video, I decided to start with the Purr preset. The distortion sounded rich and warm to me, but the overall tone is much darker than I wanted for this song. So I'll start by turning off the EQ, and then I was twiddling knobs for a while listening to the loop play, and that brings me to a sidebar. I am playing this through my CR5X Mackie monitors because that's how I practice. Things do sound quite different with my headphones, so just be aware that headphones can really color the low end of your sound. Also, if you're going to use AmpliTube through a PA, things might sound very different when you get there. You might need to have the PA settings tweaked to get it back to your desired sound, or you may need a preset for playing with the band versus practicing at home. End sidebar. I can save a lot of time by going to my final settings. I ended up bringing the bass down from 5 to 1.7. The mids went up from 3.5 to 5.8. The treble went up from 6.5 to 8. I left the pull shift knob pulled, and I upped the value to 8.0. At the end of this process, I will use the volume knob to match the jam track I am playing with. Here's how these settings sound. I do sometimes worry about my high-frequency hearing not being what it once was, but I'm setting this up for my ears and it still didn't sound bright enough. I turned the EQ on. In the previous video, we left this at my best guess for the recommended V-shape. I wasn't sure whether these sliders were all additive or attenuating or both, so the first thing I did was figure that out. I flatlined all the knobs on the center line. That looked to be about 4.4. Then I toggled the EQ on and off. That sounded louder with the EQ off. I then spent some time dragging them up. So this EQ appears to both attenuate in the range below 5 and increase gain above 5. I then dragged each band up and down the full extent to hear the impact. At first, I found nothing I liked about the 80 Hz slider, so I left it at 0. But I wasn't happy with the final sound, so there is a little danger in assuming too much from isolating each of these sliders. The bandwidth for them sounds to me like they are pretty broad and they overlap each other, so I probably should have started out from the flatline setting and made small adjustments as each frequency band appears to influence its neighbor. Still, I found it helpful to drag to the extremes to hear what each band did. I ended up attenuating the 80 Hz range, but not nearly so dramatically. I was surprised that the 750 Hz band ended up below the 80 Hz band. I also ended up pushing the higher frequencies pretty hard. I still wasn't quite satisfied with the tone, but I thought instead of EQ that maybe reverb would brighten things up. The amp was still at the 1.5 setting. I did modify it, but the built-in reverb doesn't add brightness the way I think plate and spring reverbs do. I played with pedals and rack effects, and eventually I remembered that I might be able to get what I was after with the room. Initially, the room mix volume was so low I couldn't hear much, so I pushed the volume up and experimented with rooms. And I don't know why, it's probably those tire tracks, but I ended up in the garage. I messed with placement, but ended up with the initial mid-range setting. I then pushed the volume to the max, which actually sounded kind of fun, but didn't really go too well with the jam track. I backed it down to about -5, and that seemed to finally scratch my itch for the bright, slightly trashy sound I was after. So, no fancy pedals or rack effects after all. My next tweak was speakers, and I suspect that because I live in California, I felt compelled to try the California Reds, and I liked them. A lot of the mic fine-tuning is still beyond me, and I stayed with the default microphones, but ended up with both of them dead center. I think originally I clicked on the splitter button by accident. I left it mostly alone, but did experiment with panning one cabinet to the left and one to the right. The volume didn't sound very balanced, so I backed off, and once I got in the 20 to 30% range, it started to sound nicely balanced, but it seemed to add a little breathing room into the sound, so I left it in. I thought a little more distortion might be in order. I made some adjustments to the amp and even tried some pedals, but I didn't like the changes. Eventually, I thought to try the input volume. Pushing this between 3 and 6 dB seemed like a positive change, but it was hard to tell if it was just liking the fact that it was louder. It occurred to me that I might be able to minimize this effect with a limiter. I added the white 2A rack effect. I put the limit switch on, and then adjusted the output so the overall volume sounded pretty much the same with the effect on or off. I pushed the peak reduction pretty hard, then I closed my eyes and I dragged that input slider. It wasn't perfect, as the sound would still increase a little bit, but it did make it easier to concentrate on the distortion. I left the input near plus 5 dB. Then I bypassed the limiter. The honeymoon with the reverb is wearing off, and I'm hearing a bit more than I like, so let's adjust the room mix, the bus mix, and the master mix to keep the output around 0. I'm going to save this off. As you experiment, it can be helpful to save presets with slightly different suffixes. This will let you A/B compare them with a single click in the preset menu. Even if you hate the sound I ended up with, I hope something here helps you dial in the sound you want. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please post them and I'll do my best to respond. This wraps up what I had planned for the Mark IV exploration. I'm not sure what's next, but I hope to see you in the next video.